Hello, my name is Sam Knights. I'm a barrister and one of the founders of the Shoot Festival. I'm speaking to you this evening from our home in Shoot, surrounded by wild flower meadows, bees, but a locked up church where we would normally hold our festival events. We're now in the 5th year, but this is the first time due to the pandemic that we've held our events online, and we're making them all free at this time. We're absolutely delighted to be hosting this evening's event with the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. So a very warm, sunny Devon welcome to you all, wherever you're joining us from this evening. We are recording the event and it'll be available afterwards on both the festival and on the Royal Society for Asian Affairs YouTube channels as soon as we can upload it. Christina, we have known each other for years, but very sadly, rarely get to meet in person. And of course, today is not going to be one of those days. You're supposed to be having a holiday right now and zooming in from Portugal. So let us hope that the connection between rural Devon and rural Portugal works. You're obviously Chief Foreign Correspondent of the Sunday Times. You've been reporting on wars for over 30 years. You've won more awards than I can possibly name, and of course an OBE for your services to journalism, and you've written many best-selling books. Your new and extraordinary book, which we're here to discuss this evening, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, What War Does to Women, is the first major account of female rape and violence in conflict. It made me weep and spoke volumes to me as a lawyer acting for refugees and those fleeing conflict and survivors of trafficking and slavery. But far more important people than me have reviewed it. Anthony Beevor describes it as quite literally the most powerful and disturbing book that he's ever read. And Peter Frankopan describes it as profoundly moving and required reading. I couldn't agree more. I'm going to start by asking Christina some questions, and then we'll leave about 20 minutes at the end for you to ask questions. So please do start typing your questions in at the bottom of the screen. You'll see the Q&A box. And if you want to say something nice or make a comment, then you can do that in the chat box. I think we've got Christina back with us now. She froze for a moment. Christina, I wanted to start actually by asking you about what it's been like as a war correspondent in lockdown, COVID-19. You're more normally zooming about in conflict zones, but you've been in London in lockdown, and you've been doing some extraordinary reporting on, including the story you wrote about the bus drivers of London. But what's it been like for you as a correspondent, not being able to move?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting this. It's really nice to talk to you. I'm sorry that we're not actually together with a glass of wine in lovely Devon, but and thanks to everybody who's listening, because I gather it's very hot there, so you'll probably like to be outside in the sun. So no, it's not been a great time to be a foreign correspondent, to be completely honest. Not being able to travel as a foreign correspondent is fairly limiting. And it's a bit frustrating because the rest of the world hasn't stopped, but we've become so completely focused on what's happening to us. And I suppose that's not surprising because, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. This is the worst thing that most of us have ever been through. And it's a huge domestic story. So I have spent a lot of time last few weeks not being able to travel, but doing reporting from my own country. And it's the first time really since I've started out that I've ever done that. So it's actually been very interesting. And I've tried to look at things in the way I suppose I do as a foreign correspondent. And I've been very concerned that each day we hear these huge numbers of people killed, you know, maybe 10 times the number that were killed in the Grenfell Tower disaster or in the 7/7 bombings. And yet they become, we don't know anything about people. And I find that very frustrating. So I have tried to focus very much on the human side.
I mean, that's obviously been a feature of, you know, your work throughout, you know, giving a voice to the voiceless, trying to report on things which are not being reported. I wanted to go back actually, you know, a bit in time. You started as a war correspondent at the age of 22. You were in Peshawar. It was 1987, and you were reporting on the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I mean, you were taking what appeared to be incredible risks at that time. You've written from really dangerous situations. But what was it like being a correspondent then, and how has it changed in terms of security and technology and that sort of thing?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think when you're 22, you think that you're invincible. And so I don't remember ever really thinking that much about the danger. And I had gone to live in Peshawar, and I was of Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union. But a big difference in today from then is that journalists have become targets. When I started out, that wasn't the case. We were regarded by both sides as observers to report. They might not like reporting, but they weren't killers. And it was dangerous because it was a war zone and there were mines and bombs and people shooting at each other, and you might be in the middle of that. But nobody was actually trying to kill you personally. Whereas today, journalists become the front line, and people see it as, some of the terrorist groups see it as something that will get them more publicity, killing a journalist, than killing a soldier. And we've even seen, you know, in the recent protests, Black Lives Matters protests in the United States, a lot of attacks on journalists by authorities. I mean, 300 attacks within a week, which was more than there normally would be in 3 years in the US. But the other way that the job has changed is the communications, and that's the good side. When I started out, the only way to send my stories back was by telex machines, if people watching remember those, or to actually dictate my copy on the telephone. But I was in places, so Afghanistan didn't have any direct phone lines, so you had to go to Pakistan to phone, and even there was no direct phone line. You had to go through an international operator who often needed a little bit of gentle persuasion, to often of a monetary value, in order to put the call through. So it could be very frustrating. And I remember that I was in Peshawar. I was supposed to be going into Afghanistan with a group that were fighting in Kabul the night that General Zia, the then military dictator of Pakistan, was killed in a mysterious air crash. And I was waiting to go, and had actually asked a friend that I was staying with if he would get some vodka, because there was a sort of smuggler's market nearby, and I wanted to drink a vodka before I went. And split Gorbachev in those days. So he went to this market, and he didn't want to go, actually. He was saying, oh, anyway, about 10 minutes later, he came back, and it wasn't enough time to have bought the vodka. And he said to me, oh, you won't believe what's happened. General Zia has been killed. And I said to him, well, if you don't want to get this vodka, you can come up with something a bit more convincing than that. So he said, no, he's really been killed. And then I spoke to people, and it was true. There'd been this mysterious air crash, which to this day, we don't know what happened. There's stories of exploding mango boxes and all sorts of things. And anyway, and so it was a massive story. And I was one of the only foreign journalists in Pakistan. And I just could not get a phone line. And it was the old rotary phones where you used to have to dial round and round to get to the international operator. And I was almost in tears because it was night and I needed to get through, and I just couldn't get a line. And finally, I think it took about an hour. By the time I did, I was in such a state. And I was lucky because the Financial Times, who I was then working for, the foreign news editor who answered, Stuart Dorby, he was a veteran correspondent. He'd been in Vietnam and places. And he said to me, okay, sit down. have a cigarette. I shouldn't say that now. And this is what we need. And we kept the phone line open while I wrote, which cost a fortune, but was the only way to sort of guarantee not losing it. And then I filed. And that is so different. I mean, I would say in those days, 90% of my job was logistics, finding a way to get the story back. Whereas today, I can, with mobile phone and internet and satellite technology, I can send a story back instantly from anywhere, the top of a mountain in the Hindu Kush or the middle of the desert in Iraq, which has made life much easier. The only thing I would say is there is some value to having a bit more time sometimes before you send a story. And there's been mistakes made by people, or they've become victims of propaganda because they're sending things back so quickly.
Right. I mean, I wanted also to ask you about this sort of the culture before we kind of get into the book, the culture of journalism and what it's like as a female war correspondent, because I mean, there still have been relatively few female war correspondents, and war and the way it's been reported, and this is one of the things, the themes you bring out in your book, is it's been reported in such a male way. And so why is this? You do speak about in the book about wanting to get more stories in newspapers about what's going on the ground for women and children, but there being a sort of pushback. So what is the culture like, if you like?
Well, it's changed. I mean, when I started out, there were very few other women doing this. But actually, because it was what I started off doing, I didn't really, I don't remember being that aware of it. In a way, I saw it as an advantage because I could go in Afghanistan, I could go and talk to, and in Northwest Pakistan too, I could talk to women everywhere, whereas my male colleagues could only talk to the men. And I think that the Afghan Mujahideen who I traveled with, kind of saw women almost as a sort of, I mean, foreign women, journalists, almost as a sort of third sex or something, like we were some kind of alien species, but they were fascinated. I mean, they used to ask me endless questions about why I wasn't married, how much I would cost, you know, how many buffaloes it might cost to buy me, and things like that. But I always was very interested in what happened to women in the war, and I guess that was because I was a woman, and I always found that much more fascinating than the actual fighting. The fighting I didn't really like very much. I didn't want to be in the middle of the bang bang, as you call it. I was much more interested in how people survived in a situation like that, and how they brought up their children and sheltered the elderly and educated the children. And that was very much what women were doing. So I've always focused on that side, and it was much later, because also to bear in mind, when I started out as a journalist, there was no internet or anything. So I never saw the newspapers, right? It was like I was sending my stories into a black hole. So I didn't really see what other people were writing, or what, you know, I just knew what I'd seen and what I wrote, and I didn't know much. I wasn't aware. So it was really much later when I came to live back in the UK, and then was seeing what was going in the papers, and saw that actually, in general, a much more kind of male view of what was happening was appearing.
Yeah, I mean, you give this fascinating account in the book of when you were looking back at the war reporting from the Sunday Times in Iraq. There was an amazing number of foreign war correspondents embedded at one point. I think there were 6, and you said you trawled through all of the articles. And there was only, apart from you, there was only one other person who was a woman who'd actually reported a single line from an Iraqi woman. Now, of course, as you've said, you have an advantage, you know, in being a woman. You're able to talk to women, you're able to go to places that, you know, a male war correspondent probably wouldn't. I do remember one of the first books I read of yours was the sewing circles of Herat. And of course, one can't really imagine a man being invited into the sewing circle of Herat. And it was a beautifully written account of what was really going on inside, which was obviously not sewing. But this, of course, you know, gave you access and allowed you, of course, to tell the horrendous accounts that you tell in the book. I want to turn now to the book and ask you, was there a trigger for writing this? Because you have been writing about this for a long time. You've been collecting these stories, but what was the trigger for actually writing the book now?
Yeah, well, just, I mean, on that last point, I mean, one thing I would say is it has changed a lot. And now there are lots of female reporters, particularly in the Middle East, which is great. So I think that has changed things. But I have never written, I've never had a female foreign editor, or until earlier this year, never had a female editor of the newspaper. So, and I do think that having men decide what is important and what goes in the paper is also makes a huge difference, not just having the person on the ground, what they're reporting, because there's no good me writing lots of stuff about what's happening to women if a man back in the office won't publish it. So yeah, the reason that I became so obsessed really about the issue of sexual violence in conflict is because, as I said, I was always for 30 years talking to women more in a positive way about how they were surviving in these difficult situations. But, you know, there is a very brutal side of war to women too, and that is sexual violence. And it seemed to me that in the last 5 or 6 years, I have seen more brutality against women than at any time in the 30 odd years that I've been reporting. And I just found that really difficult to understand. And the stories were also just so horrendous and heartbreaking. And it wasn't enough just to report on them.
Right. I mean, that's really troubling, this idea that you've seen much more brutal violence in the last 5 years. So why is this? What's the cause of this, do you think?
Well, I mean, the first time I really was so shocked to hear some of these stories was the Yazidis, who, as you know, were abducted in thousands from Shingal, where they live in between Iraq and Syria, and taken by ISIS fighters, taken into really latter-day slave markets and divided up into groups, whether they were ugly or beautiful. And then fighters would come and choose them and buy them and then trade them. And meeting some of these girls with the most awful stories. You know, I met a girl called Naima who was traded 12 times between different ISIS fighters, as if she was a goat or something. And stories of men putting the names into a hat and then picking out names of which girl they were taking. And a girl of 16 who told me that the worst night of her life was when this fat judge who'd been raping her every night then brought back a 10-year-old girl and was raping her in the room next door as she cried for her mother. I mean, these are really so difficult stories. And around the same time, I was going quite a lot to northeast Nigeria, because you might remember the Chibok girls who were abducted from their school in Chibok by Boko Haram fighters and taken into the bush. And so that got a lot of attention, really, because of a hashtag, Bring Back Our Girls, and people like Michelle Obama taking selfies holding up the hashtag. And so suddenly that became a huge story, and I went out to do something on that, and then found that in the camps in northern Nigeria there were thousands of girls. That this actually was just the tip of the iceberg, and so many girls had been taken. And it was so incredibly sad, because what would happen was they'd be taken, forced to marry, or be raped by these Boko Haram fighters, and if they were pregnant they would actually cut out the fetus with a bayonet And then they would be, if they were released or managed to escape, then often the Nigerian army was raping them again. And then they would be taken to camps, and in the camps their families or communities would not take them back because they would see them as sullied and shameful. And so they would then, the only way they could actually survive would be to sleep with the camp officials to get food. So these poor girls, some of whom were 12 or 13 years old, were really being victims over and over again. It was really heartbreaking to hear their stories. And then again, around the same time, following year, the Rohingya women who were attacked by the Burmese army, who came into their villages, killed men, set fire to their huts, and then tied the women to banana trees and gang raped them in front of their children. And that was on such a scale. You remember about 700,000 Rohingya fled into Bangladesh, and every woman you spoke to had a story. So all these things, and you just felt, you know, this is the 21st century. Why is this going on on such a scale in all these places?
Yeah, I mean, it's eye-watering, your account, and it's detailed, and the common theme, of course, is that everybody you're talking to is going to have some form of post-traumatic stress disorder from what they've suffered. And I mean, how you go about, you know, preparing yourself to talk to people like that. Certainly as lawyers, that's something, you know, we've become a lot more aware of when we're taking evidence from people who have survived these situations, because the concern is always that you'll re-traumatize somebody. But these women that you're speaking to, somehow they find the inner strength to talk to you. But I mean, it must have been a difficult process. So how did you go about sort of preparing yourself and helping them, I suppose, not be re-traumatized when they're retelling?
Well, that of course is, you know, your biggest fear in doing something like this. The last thing you want to do is for people who've been through such a really incredibly awful ordeal is to then make them relive it. So actually, when I did the book, I didn't just kind of go to places and, you know, anyone here been raped and speak English, that whole perhaps apocryphal journalistic account, but I spoke to people working in camps, or I spoke to psychiatrists or trauma therapists who were working with some of the women, and asked them if there was anybody that was prepared to talk to me. And it generally, where we could, there would be someone present to, like a trauma therapist. But I mean, unfortunately, in many of these places, they don't have access to that kind of facility. So I was always really, for the book, talking to people who wanted to tell their stories, and they wanted to tell them because they want this to stop and they don't want this to happen to other people. But as a journalist, and it's something I became very concerned about, was, you know, often we are the first people that speak to deeply traumatized people. Definitely with the Rohingya, you know, we're all coming across the border into Bangladesh, and we were, you know, stopping them and saying, what happened to you, and tell us your story. And we're not trained how to deal with deeply traumatized people. And the thing that I didn't really realize until working on the book and looking at the justice side was that we could prejudice their case because we were, you know, all asking them questions, and then several different journalists would be interviewing the same person, and maybe the account would be slightly different each time. And it would make it, if anybody was then able to go to court over their case, it would make it extremely difficult for them. And that's deeply troubling.
Yeah.
And it was, of course, you know, difficult to listen to these stories too, but I felt so strongly, I do feel so strongly, that I wanted to give a platform to them so that people realized what was going on. The book is it could have been done in a different way. The book is I don't paraphrase anybody, everybody's story. And so sometimes it may seem a bit repetitive or, but I wanted to be told the way they told me and chose to tell the story. And I also included lots of people and lots of places because I wanted to give a sense of how big a problem this is. And honestly, I began to feel I could spend the rest of my life probably researching this, because unfortunately it's happening in many places.
I want to come on to talking about the what is needed in terms of support and also about the international and the domestic justice side of things. But before we leave this topic of trauma, I wanted to ask you as well about how you protect yourself from being secondarily traumatized, because as you say, you've taken, hundreds of really detailed accounts with hundreds of hours being spent, and that doesn't come without a very significant impact on you as well. So how do you, if you like, sort of protect yourself from that sort of trauma as well?
Now I'm on holiday in Portugal. I try to kind of do things that are different. In the old pre-COVID days, I used to go to the theatre a lot and read a lot of novels and just try and do things that are not what I'm writing about, and also spend time with my family and friends who are not working on these kind of issues. But as I said, however difficult it might have been for me to hear, it's way more difficult for those women to tell me what happened, and a million times more. It's incomparable with the difficulty of what they'd actually gone through. So I just felt very strongly that I wanted people to know what was happening.
Yeah.
And one of the girls I spoke to, she said, because she was really finding it difficult to tell her story, and I kept saying to her, don't you want to stop? You don't need to do this. And she said, no, I don't want anyone ever to be able to didn't know.
Hello, have we still got you, Christina?
I think so.
Yeah,
I said
yeah.
that one of the girls said to me that she said, I don't want anyone to ever be able to say, I didn't know what was happening.
Yes,
that's what makes me kind of angry about this, because the Yazidis, for example, they told their stories. People do know what happened. It was well reported. It's not a secret what happened to them. And yet there hasn't been a single prosecution of any of the ISIS fighters for what they did. It was just before lockdown in Baghdad, there was just one case of an ISIS fighter, and that was because a woman, a Yazidi woman, actually went to the court and faced him and made them listen to her. And that, to me, is the real problem in justice for this issue, that it only happens if they brave and go through things they really shouldn't have to go through.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this side, because it's so important, and you talk about the history of the international justice system in your book. Rape is a war crime, and what you're reporting is also slavery and trafficking, repeated slavery and trafficking, which are also international crimes and war crimes. And yet, the first prosecution for rape as a war crime only came in 1998, and that was at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So you talk about this in your book, and it wasn't inevitable that it was going to happen. The way you describe you talk to one of the young female prosecutors, and it looks, the way it was set up looks sort of underfunded, and people weren't really prepared. But the Tutsi women came forward and they gave these incredible testimonies of wide-scale sexual violence. But initially, there were no charges for rape. So what happened in that tribunal to change things?
Well, so on that tribunal, which was in Arusha, one of the judges was a woman, a rather remarkable South African woman called Navi Pillay. and who had set up her own practice in South Africa and looking a lot at domestic violence, but she'd been very involved in dismantling the apartheid laws. And she was listening. So there, as you say, there was no case on rape or sexual violence, but she was listening to this case, which was about torture and murder. And a woman who was testifying was speaking, and then she said, and then they raped me. And literally the male prosecutors said, well, moving on. So Navi Pillay said, well, hang on a minute. I mean, this, can we not hear what happened to her? This woman's come all the way to testify for doing this. So she insisted that they heard the full stories. The woman then said, and so she said to her, well, you know, what do you mean they were raping people? And she said, yeah, there were lots of people were being raped at the town hall. And then she told this story. And then that meant that other people, other women that testified, they asked them and they said the same thing. So then the case actually then got stopped and the charges were reframed to include sexual violence. And these 5 really brave women then went and told their stories, even though they were getting death threats. And one of the women that was working with them, her husband and son were murdered. So, so they were really remarkable. But those women, you know, today they're still living in really desperate situation, very poor women. And they said to me, they thought when they got this first conviction that would change things and this would never happen to women again. And so they are baffled to hear about the Yazidis and other groups, because they really felt that they had made a difference.
Right, and I mean, we can see sort of going forward how very few international prosecutions there have been for rape as a war crime. The ICC, when it was set up, rape was you know, within the Rome Statute, so it was there to be used. But I think it was only July last year when there was the first conviction for rape as a war crime. There was a previous conviction, but it was overturned on appeal. So this is obviously a huge problem. I mean, do you think it's a coincidence that Pillay was a female judge? I mean, would it
no,
have been otherwise?
I don't think it's a coincidence, because just as I, as a female journalist, talk to women about these issues, every case that I find where there's been successful prosecution, there's been a woman judge on the bench or a woman prosecutor, and you know, it can't be a coincidence. And I think one of the problems with this is that, you know, people will say, well, there's always been rape in war, and kind of, you know, link it in with, you know, pillage, you know, looting, and as if it doesn't really matter. It's just something that happens in war. And if you go back, and yes, I mean, it has always happened. It happened, you know, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians. If you read Herodotus' histories, it starts with abduction of women. And probably, you know, the biggest case or example of this in more recent history is in Germany, the liberation of Berlin and the Red Army soldiers, and 2 million Germans are believed to have been raped by the Red Army soldiers. And yet in the Nuremberg trial, and we think about Nuremberg, we think about international justice, there was no cases on rape. It wasn't discussed as an issue. And you know, this seems to me to happen over and over again when conflicts are brought to an end, that somehow this is regarded as a side issue that doesn't matter as much as the killing. And I tell you, every one of these women that I spoke to said to me, I wish I had been killed. I would rather that than have lived through this situation. So it's not a side issue. It is something, it is a war crime. You know, the silence over this needs to end, I think.
Right, and it's probably no coincidence. Of course, Pillay is now a judge on the one of the appointed judges in the International Court of Justice, hearing the Rohingya case, which has handed down a preliminary judgment, and rape is before the court on that case. The rape.
Yeah, I was there actually in The Hague in December, and everybody was astonished because Aung San Suu Kyi came and actually led the defense of the Myanmar Burmese military and stood there completely impassive as the most horrendous account read out of rape of women and mass rape, and just showed no emotion and made no mention of it when she spoke.
You've spoken a lot about the support that women need, and I wanted to just bring in Dr. Mukwege, who you write about, because it's just so it's such a remarkable thing that he's doing. He has this hospital and working on rehabilitating and doing surgery for the victims. I think he's treated 55,000 victims, or his hospital has, in 20 years. So how did you find him, and what insight does he bring as regards the motives, what's going on? I mean, he's doing reconstructive surgery on babies. I mean, why are babies being raped in war? What's going on?
Well, I mean, doing a book like this, of course, does make you think about men, and because 100% of the perpetrators in my book were male. That is there something about men that they would do this given the opportunity? But a lot of the heroes in my book are male too, and one of the heroes is Dr. Mukwege. And he is just really the most remarkable man I think I've ever met. And he is a gynecologist who set up this hospital, which was actually meant to deal with maternal mortality in DRC, which is where he's from, because it was so high. But then the first women that came to him had actually been raped, and in an incredibly brutal manner, with their vaginas set fire to. And he was really shocked and first thought, oh, this was just a sort of individual case because it was so brutal. But then more and more women came and told him similar stories. So he ended up focusing on that. And as you say, his hospitals treated 55,000 women, and he risks his life because there are a lot of people in the Congo that don't like what he's doing, because he also speaks out a lot. And he received the Nobel Peace Prize a year ago jointly with Nadia Murad, the Yazidi girl who was the first woman to speak out about what happened to her. So that actually looked like a really positive development, that here was the international community recognizing sexual violence issue. But he's very depressed about it, because he says, he went to the ceremony, he made his very powerful speech about what was happening, and everybody applauded. And then he said, and then that was it. And that wasn't the point. He wasn't doing this to try and get some kind of honor or award. He wanted to change things. And he says he feels that maybe we need this different word for war rape, that to make people take it more seriously. And the week that I spent at his hospital in Bukavu in Eastern Congo, that week, a 6-month-old baby and a 4-year-old girl were brought into the hospital, both of whom had been raped, and I mean horrendously raped. And it's just unimaginable. And he says he finds it really difficult to deal with, because actually the percentage of children now being brought is going up a lot.
And what's the reason, do you think, for that? Is that part of the use in a particular conflict of rape or weapons?
He doesn't really know. I mean, I think it's just the brutality in the society, sort of anything goes. I mean, there have been cases where people have raped babies there because they think it will somehow give them magic powers and make them invisible against. And so that in Congo, I mean, this rape is being carried out by lots of different groups. It's militias that are trying to control areas. I mean, perhaps we should sort of talk about that a lot. That sexual violence in war and conflict is used for different reasons. And I mostly looked at it as a weapon of war, where people were actually ordered to do it and were doing it in order to humiliate the enemy, to take over territory and drive people out. And that is how it's being used in the DRC. The DRC is a very, very mineral rich country and produces some of the things we need for our lives today, such as for iPhones and iPads and electric cars, the cobalt for the batteries. And so these are very lucrative things. And to get control of those areas, these militias are raping the women in the area to drive people out. And so, you know, you could argue that there is some responsibility for us that are using these products, because, you know, how many people realize that that is what is going on in the areas where the minerals are produced. And so some of these militias do believe that they get magic powers by killing the babies. Others, I think, you know, it's all part of this really dehumanizing the enemy and just not caring what you do to them.
I want to bring in some of the questions. We've got so many questions from people, and brilliant questions. So let me throw a few of these questions at you. One from Hookie Walker saying, this parenthetically male behaviour is despicable. What's the psychological explanation for this? That's one question. And another question from Michael Ryder. We know that rape in war is not new. The stories you have reported can only be heard if there is someone who wants to find out, victims are willing to talk, and an audience willing to listen. There's a long way to go, but all of those seem to have changed in recent years. You know, why has it taken so long? Do you want to?
Yeah, well, the first question, they're both very good questions. The first question is hard to answer, the psychological explanation. There's a lot of discussion about whether rape in war is more about power than sex. You know, because it's quite hard to imagine that you could really get much pleasure from doing some of these things. And I think there's also, you know, places, it's very hard to come up with one explanation. There are some groups where there's sort of, it's become almost like a laddish thing and everyone else is doing it and you join in. It's gang rape, some where people have actually been ordered to do it, some where, like with ISIS, they were told that this was an ideological thing, that the Yazidis were devil worshippers and that it was their duty to enslave them and do these things. So it's hard to come up with one explanation. And actually, I think this is a subject for a book for someone else to do about the perpetrators, because very little to do, you know. And I tried, because, as I said earlier, that you become a bit, you start to think all the time, you're writing up these reports of what happened to these women and these appalling stories, and it does make you wonder about what the men get from it. So I tried to interview some perpetrators, and I was given access in Iraq to some ISIS fighters who had kept Yazidi women. But whereas I said to you at the beginning that I thought generally it had been an advantage for me being a woman reporting, in that case I don't think it was, because sitting with ISIS fighters as a Western woman, asking them about raping Yazidi women, I didn't get very much information. So, this book was really much more about the testimony of the women, but I do think it's a fascinating subject, and I would really like to know more about this. And then the second question, well, I do think, you know, people, there is much more awareness now, partly, you know, things, people like Dr. Mukwege, the Nobel Peace Prize, but you know, there's much less awareness than there should be. And I've had issues with writing things where, including actually about Dr. Mukwege and the babies and children. I wrote an article for the Sunday Times magazine about this, and my editor said, why are we shouldn't run this because nobody will want to read it. It's too horrendous. Now I feel very strongly that just because something is uncomfortable to read doesn't mean that we should ignore it, otherwise things won't change. So that fortunately the magazine at that time had a female editor, Eleanor Mills, who's a real advocate, and she really argued strongly that we should run it. And the good thing was we got incredible reader response. In fact, people gave a lot of money to Mukwege's hospital, so that was a kind of nice proof that people did want to know about it and wanted to do something.
Right. So, I mean, we've got a number of questions as well about, what needs to be done. But just picking up off your last point, I mean, a question from Tanya Bruce Lockhart. Do you think that men have become more sexually brutal because women have found their voice? Is it a form of punishment? And I suppose linked to that, is there a concern that the more that the stories are told, that perhaps there'll be a backlash, and then what can you do to support women? What do these women need to be able to be safe to tell their stories?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's changed in rape in war, if you like, is most of the recent cases have been militias rather than, or terrorist groups rather than armies. The last sort of big example of an army doing this on a wide scale was the Red Army in the Second World War, and then the Japanese army too, both doing things like the rape of Nanjing, but also the comfort women, or so-called comfort women, who they took. Again, no justice, and again, actually not even any acknowledgement of what happened for many of those women. But in some ways it's more complicated when it is militias to do something about it. You hope that if it's a national army or a police, that more pressure can be brought on them. And I think countries like the UK, which has taken a stand on this, William, who was Foreign Secretary, set up a department in the Foreign Office called Preventing Sexual Violence, had a big conference with Angelina Jolie, and yet, we don't seem in practice to be doing that much. We're not kind of withholding aid from countries like Congo because this is happening on a wide scale, where we didn't take in Yazidi women who had gone through this. So, it's all very well talking about it and saying that we stand for something, but, I'd like to see a lot more actually done in practice. And the department that William Hague set up has been decimated, really. I think at one point it had 60 people, and now it's got, 2 or 3 who may not be there now because I think they're working on COVID-19. So, it needs an international effort, because the key to changing this is justice. The reason I think it's happening more and more is because of the complete impunity. And it's very hard for women in these places to get justice. They don't have access to lawyers and media and resources. Often, and this is the saddest thing about it, they are regarded as there's a stigma against them, and so rather than the perpetrator, they're the ones that are sort of regarded by their communities as having done something wrong, and which is just so awful and so sad. And so there are some organisations like Dr. McCreggie's organisation, actually, which not only does he have his hospital, but he's trying to create a network of survivors to talk, because it needs to come from them of what they really need. Everyone I spoke to said, you know, they needed justice, but they also need help often to have some kind of income, because, you know, small loans and training and things that enable them to actually survive economically, because they're so often ostracized. But, you know, I don't think I'm sort of talking about examples where these are often poor or illiterate women, but it's not only that. I mean, I went to Argentina and talked to women there who, during the dictatorship in the late 70s and early 80s, had been abducted. As you know, thousands of people were disappeared and all these torture centers were set up. What I didn't know, and in fact I visited the main museum there, which was the biggest torture center, ESMA, and there was no mention of it, that actually some of the women that were taken there were sexually abused and kept as sex slaves by some of the military officers. And it's only now, all these years afterwards, that it's coming out and going to court, and because the women felt ashamed and felt that they couldn't speak about it. And the few women that did try and speak in cases were again kind of closed down and told that this isn't relevant and this isn't part of the things that we need to be looking at. And so talking to some of those women who were women like us, you know, university educated, who had means, who were eloquent, and yet even they had not felt that they'd been able to go to court, and for 30 years hadn't spoken about this. That just shows how difficult this issue is.
Yes, and of course there's an interesting parallel with the Me Too movement, and which is happening all over the world, but also in the UK, and then the child abuse inquiries, which have been going on in the UK, and so many of the victims, you know, have kept silent for decades, some of them over 30 years. So, I mean, this is obviously something which is not just, of course, a problem which is out there. It's a problem, you know, here with domestic violence, you know, with violence against women in all sorts of places outside conflict as well. We're running out of time, but I did want to ask two questions, and perhaps you can sort of give a short answer. One from Georgia, wanting to ask about the lack of information in the conflict in Palestine and Israel, and whether there, as there have been accounts of rape being used there, but is there a reason for there not being more information about rape in that particular conflict? And then a question from William Blackburn: do you think the ease with which people can communicate and share imagery these days has contributed to the increasing brutalization of terrorists? And if so, what's the solution? Two meaty questions.
Well, the first question about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it's interesting because one of the things that's fascinating about this subject is why in some conflicts is this not happening, or happening on much less scale, and yet in others it's so prevalent. And actually, in Israel-Palestinian conflict, there are a few examples compared to other conflicts. Now, the Israeli army has quite a high percentage of female soldiers, and it does seem that makes a difference in an army. And I know that the British Army, which has taken up this issue and is, you know, feels that General Carter, the head of the Defence Forces, feels strongly that that's the way to change things. And also, obviously, the discipline within forces makes a lot of difference. And both sides, I guess, there are quite disciplined in different ways. So, but again, this is a subject I think I would like to see more research on, why it's happening so much in some places and some conflicts and not in others. And then the second question about the social media and the use of imagery. Well, I mean, there's some that's, I'm not sure so much in sexual violence. Certainly it's something in terms of violence generally, like terrorist attacks and things, that in the media we've been concerned about, that often you feel people are doing things because they know that it will get big headlines. And you know, early on when ISIS was beheading people, those pictures used to appear on TV and in newspapers, not the really graphic, but you know. And I was one of the people that felt very strongly that we shouldn't be running those pictures, because that's what they wanted. They want people to see that and spread. And if we don't give them the oxygen of publicity, I'm not naive, it's not going to stop altogether, but you know, I don't think we should be playing into their hands by publishing that. But it is difficult now because of social media, that even if traditional media, if you like, don't publish these pictures, often you can access them through other ways. And as everyone knows, I'm sure that there's been lots of discussion about groups that they should be more responsible for what comes out on platforms.
Christina, there are lots of other questions, and I apologise if we haven't got to your question, but we have unfortunately run out of time. I just want to say, first of all, an absolutely enormous thank you to Christina for zooming in on her holiday. And please, I would urge you to buy this amazing book, and do consider ordering it through our local independent bookshop, Archway Bookshop. They can deliver it to you anywhere in the UK, and indeed outside the UK as well. If you go online and type in the title, it will pop up. Thank you, all of you as well, who have donated to the festival at this time. This helps us keep us online and free to all, and it will also help us do some outreach with our local primary school, much needed outreach on creative writing and non-fiction writing, the sort of thing that unfortunately there is no funding or time for in the curriculum. So we have another timely event tomorrow on race and criminal justice, which we're co-hosting with the Lime Crime Festival at 6 p.m. With panelists from the UK and the US. So please do join us for that if you can. But Christina, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to all our participants for your fantastic comments and your questions. Stay well and stay engaged.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.